Welcome to the Even Better podcast, where your host, Seneca Waugh of Your Clear Next Step, brings you exciting content about making communities better by helping people get even better at work.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Even Better podcast. This is your host, Seneca Waugh, and on behalf of all of us at Your Clear Next Step, we are so delighted that you joined us to just tune in to this way of helping make our workdays even better so that together we can co-create better communities. I am ecstatic to have back with us again today, Becky Naderman. Becky, thanks so much for coming back.
You're welcome, Seneca. It's great to be back with you again.
This is a joy. For those of you who have not had a chance to hear Becky's other podcast, do go back and find that. Of course, you found this on the Spotify list or the Apple podcast or any of the other podcast platforms. Go back and listen to Becky's prior session and check out Becky Naderman. What an amazing story she shares of her experience here in the Des Moines area. That's how Becky and I got to know each other, because we are both women of faith in the Des Moines area. Our paths crossed somewhere along the line, and I'm just fascinated by her story and humbled by her commitment to continue to fight with and break down the biases that we have internally and wrestle with those and just share her own story of discovery. And Becky, I'll let you share a bit of your story as you're doing your introduction here. But we're going to talk with Becky today about something that she has been personally involved in. And I just asked her to come back and share some insights for her. And it's 4 ways to challenge your unconscious bias. So Becky, tell us a little bit of your story, that why and how you've encountered these ways to challenge your unconscious bias.
Well, Seneca, I'm a mom. And so in raising my daughters, and even in my own personal journey, I always have looked for ways to improve myself all the time and to be looking for ways in which I can include more people in my circle of friends and people who challenge me. And often people who challenge me are people who look at the world from a different perspective or have a different life experience. And in doing that, many times it's opened my eyes to see that my small view of the world has limited me from considering someone else's point of view, therefore, AKA given me bias. And then looking at that bias to say, okay, now that I can see it and I hear it and I notice it in my own life, what can I do to change that way of thinking?
Yeah.
And so the way you know me is through the book that I authored with my friend who is incarcerated, and getting to know him and his life experience really opened my eyes even more than other friendships I'd had, because we had such vastly different life experiences, but yet we had much in common.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I really treasure about just any of the moments that I get to spend with you and enjoy your Facebook updates as well, and your challenges to all of us, is that in this moment where we as a society, and I certainly here in the US, I believe it's extending around the world as well, but where we're really opening our eyes to things that we might not have realized even about ourselves over the past, and where the racial tensions have been high these last couple of years, and we're wrestling with tough conversations. One of the things that I think you bring to the table, Becky, is your ability to say, okay, so here's what I can do about it. And to each listener, here's what you can do. Here's a practical, tactical, actionable ways that we can challenge ourselves to grow and to be better humans. And I'm so grateful for your willingness to not just put tough conversations out there, but to say, okay, so here's what we do about it.
Well, I thank you for that. And I think that, in this moment in time that we're in, certainly it's a difficult one for all of us. And these conversations aren't easy for us, whether, we exist in the majority or we live in the margins. They're difficult conversations. They put us in places where we feel insecure. We don't feel confident. We wish the conversation would just go away often. But the truth is, if we really want to be better as a society, we have to enter those spaces. We have to think about those hard questions, and we have to continue to do it. It's not like we could just look at the summer of 2020 and say, okay, we have that taken care of, on to the next thing. It's continual work for us. And so it's hard work, and I think that the more that we bring that into conversation with each other, the easier it gets for us. And that's how we make progress.
Lovely. So let's dive in. You're sharing with us today and with our listeners 4 ways to challenge your unconscious bias. Can we spend a second on unconscious bias and what that is?
Yes, it's that thought before the thought. Okay.
Mhm.
It's in our mind, and it's that reaction that we have before we had an opportunity to put that cognitive thought process to it. So it's kind of like that gut reaction thought that comes to our mind when we see someone, and we have a first impression maybe of, before they say anything, just what our ideas are as we see someone and what our expectations are.
You bet. And so to your point, the thought before the thought, before we have a chance to add the cognitive thought, before we really think about it, it's unconscious, it's buried in there somewhere. And so you're inviting us to challenge that, to stop and say, hang on a second, is that unconscious bias based on reality? What's it based on? Is it fair? Is it true? Is it right? Okay, so 4 ways to challenge your unconscious bias. So the first one you said is notice. Open that up for us. What's that mean?
I think the first thing we have to do is we have to be aware and observe what people around us are saying and how we're reacting to the things that they're saying and doing. We need to ask ourselves, well, what did that mean when I heard them say that? Or what did that mean when I saw that go on? An example that I had just a few months ago, I was going into a building that was secured, and I was having trouble getting into the building with a code that I needed. And someone came to the door and said to me, she said, "Oh, I'll let you in. You look honest." And when I heard that, I just thought to myself, I look honest. What does that mean? What does honesty look like? Does honesty have a face? Certainly, I think all of us can say, we can think of a time when we were interacting with someone and we thought, oh, they're feeding us a line, right? They're not being upfront with us. But that wasn't what was going on here. It was simply just my appearance was an honest appearance, is what she said. And so I'm asking myself, what did she mean by that? And if I looked different than I do, like, who else would she have said that to? Does my race play a role in that? Her and I shared the same race. So it's just being aware of those type of situations.
Yeah. So, and that's not just about people, right? So driving around town, you might encounter a neighborhood, for example. Like, is that unconscious bias playing there?
Right. I think, if we see certain things in a neighborhood, we might think, oh, this is a rough part of town. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just different than where we live. And maybe things are certainly harder there. But if we're in an area that doesn't look familiar to us, do we judge that? Do we find that to be a place that we have opinions about that might be incorrect?
Yeah. And so in the workplace, we might encounter this as well when perhaps a customer or someone approaches us, or in other spaces when we interact with people. And again, this is the unconscious, it's the thought before the thought. So not necessarily buried in, and we've already established a relationship with them, but something new, and just paying attention to what our brains are telling us.
Right. An example of this in the workplace would be, recently I was waiting in a doctor's office. And as I was in the waiting room, a man in his 20s came in with his child who was, under 3. And he went to check in, and the lady asked for his insurance card. And he said he didn't have his insurance card. And her immediate next question was, do you have Amerigroup, which is the state-funded insurance in our state? And so I noticed it, and I thought, why did she ask that to him? Would she have asked that to me? And as I talked with a few other people who are white, they had not encountered that if they forgot their insurance card. And so I think just noticing and observing those things of what took place there, what went on, what was the thought process, or why was it said like that?
Yeah, I had an experience. It's been a couple of years ago. In fact, it was spring, just before March of 2020. It was spring break, just before things sort of changed in the world. And I was shopping in a mall. And as I was leaving the store, the security tag on one of my sweaters that I had purchased hadn't been removed. And I didn't realize it, and the clerk didn't realize it. So as I'm going through the exit, it sets off the alarm. And at the same moment that I'm going through the exit, a man is going through, and he's youngish, he's in his 20s, and he's a Black man walking out at the same moment that I am. And the alarm goes off. And we looked at each other, and our physiological reactions in that moment, and the reactions of the people around us, were just like, that was one of those moments that I just stopped and noticed. I'm like, wait, I am, like, it's me. I am the one with the tag. Why is everybody looking at him? And why? Oh, that was one of those moments where I remember noticing for the first time. So thank you for that admonition to notice, just to pay attention. What's going on here? What's driving that?
Right. And I think once we see one thing, then it opens the door for us to see other things like that in our society. And that allows us to be able to relate with people who have experiences that we don't experience as the white majority.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so let's move on to number 2. So we're talking about 4 ways to challenge your unconscious bias. And the first one is to notice. It's really paying attention there. And the second one is to listen. So who are we listening to? What are we listening to on this one, Becky?
We're listening to ourselves. We're listening to those thoughts in our head when we encounter someone, and we, that first response we have when we see them from a distance. And what are those things that are floating around in our head? Are they true, or are they biased? And asking ourselves, where did that thought come from? Researching that thought. Is there any relevance to it? And think about the root of where those came from.
Mm. So how might that play out in a workplace situation? Are there places where we might encounter, I mean, is this just internal? Is there a group thought going on? How might that listening to those conversations, how might that work?
I think in a workplace situation, say we have somebody on our team and we think, well, they didn't respond as fast as we thought they should. If we hear in our head an assumption like, oh, they're always like that, I think we always have to be on alert for that term of they, because we're grouping people together. And so are we saying like, oh, young people, they're always on their phone? Say that might be an example, right, of grouping people together. And anytime we hear that kind of, oh, that's what we would expect of them or they, I think that is an alert for us in our head to say, wait a minute, why am I saying that? If we use the example of the bias that young people are always on their phone, there's truth in it that you can find me on my phone at times too when I shouldn't be in a meeting or something like that, right? And the same would be true of someone who's is older as well.
Yep. Oh, that makes good sense. And so the challenge here, as we think about that, I can think of the applications that would make sense, not just to racial bias, but to other kinds of biases. Your point about generational and the number of times that my husband's been called a boomer because he said something, and he is not a boomer, I assure you. And he perceives that as an affront. But the times that, to your point about, well, the kids these days, or I wonder the way we do that for people who live in certain neighborhoods or drive certain types of cars, or people with disabilities. Are there other biases that we're carrying around that are just not fair? They're not right. They're not real. And we've lived with them, and we've created these habits that may or may not aren't necessarily making work days better.
I think when you said the part about neighborhoods and our assumptions and things, I think one of the things that we need to be aware of is sometimes there's bias towards people who live in the minority, people who are marginalized groups that have succeeded and done very well, and then often might get the backhanded compliment like, you speak so eloquently, or wow, you've really been successful, that type of thing, when we wouldn't have said that to someone who didn't live in one of those marginalized groups or wasn't in the minority. And so I think that even if those things aren't verbalized, if in our head we think, oh, wow, I'm surprised they're, driving a car like that. I didn't expect that. Or, oh, they've really done well. Well, they have the same college degree I do. You have to think, would we still have said those same things had they looked differently?
Yeah. And on this one, I have a recollection. We moved around a lot as a family, and so we lived all over the world. And in one of our stops, we lived in a place where taxes were assessed based on the outward appearance of your home. So this is just an interesting cultural thing that is not done here in the US, but taxes at that time were assessed based on the outward appearance of your home. And so a lot of the homes were kind of on the outside, sort of run down and looked dilapidated, and, broken steps going up to the porch and that sort of thing. And then you'd go inside and they were warm and welcoming and, fully furnished and just looking lovely. But there was this disconnect. And we moved to another place. And I remember my brother, as we were driving around and visiting this new community that we lived where everything was clean and polished. And I remember my brother's observation of, oh, they must be so nice here. They must be so nice here because everything's all clean. And what did niceness have to do with it, right? It was this internal bias that he had made based on these observations. And we were just, we were kids. He was 5. We didn't know anything. But there's an example of like paying attention and listening to, well, what did he say? Well, they must be nice here. Why do we think that? And then taking that apart.
Yes. And I think you bring up a really valid point that those biases are seeds that are planted way, way back. Like when we're 5, those things start to get planted, and we don't have a choice in how those are planted, but we do have a choice as adults and as we get older to challenge them.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so let's move on to number 3. If you've just joined us, we're here with Becky Naderman, and we're talking about 4 ways to challenge your unconscious bias. So noticing, starting to pay attention is the first one. Listening to the thoughts in your head is the second one. And now we're on the third one, which is the litmus test. So talk us through that, Becky.
I think the litmus test is an easy way to cut to the chase with, is it a bias or not? And that is to just simply ask yourself, would I have thought this about my own self? What if this person was the same race as me? What if this person was white? Would I have wondered that same thing, thought that same thing? It's just a quick and easy way to say, where are my thoughts at?
Where are my thoughts? And that's another one too, that could go to gender. It could go to age. It could go to someone with or without disabilities. But for sure, that would I ask that question? Would I have that thought? Would I have that unconscious bias that just flickered through, that thought before the thought? Would I have that if that other person, essentially what you're saying is if that other person looked like me?
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. Like if you think about in the workplace, if someone comes to you, let's say someone doesn't get something expected finished, and they come to you and they explain that they didn't get their part of the job finished for whatever the reason is. As human beings, we tend to empathize with people who have our shared experience. So if you come to me, Seneca, you and I are roughly the same age, same race, right? We're both moms. And if you come to me and you say, I didn't get this done because, the kids came and it was so busy last night, it's easy for me to relate to that. But if you have a different life experience than me, let's say you're single, I might have an assumption, right? That, it might not be so easy for me to believe what you are telling me as to what the obstacle was to getting the job accomplished.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So we have expectations, right? Either expectations of good expectations or not good expectations, right? I remember this heartbreaking story that I listened to. It was a woman sharing her story, a Black woman sharing her story on a podcast or something, so that she's trying to get her word and her message out. And she and her husband and her 5-year-old son. So again, back to the youth, we learn these things early. They had been traveling by plane. And she and her son were on the plane and her husband wasn't there yet. And she tells the story of her husband arriving on the plane, but later, and coming down the aisle. And she engaged in a conversation with her son. And her son said, I hope he doesn't have a gun, because what the son saw was a Black man walking on an airplane late. And like it was his own father, for heaven's sakes. But that connection hadn't been made because the bias or the expectation about violence or it was so heartbreaking to stop and think about. And she wrestles with it. She talks about, guys, this was my own kid. This was my son. What are we doing here? What kind of expectations have we set about society and about those around us? Just really challenging us to break that down.
Yes, Seneca, I know the story you're talking about, and I know actually the woman that you're talking about. It's Jennifer Eberhardt, and she authored a book, Biased, and she's done an incredible amount of research on bias. And the interesting fact about this is that Jennifer herself is a Black woman, and her son also Black. The son's father is also Black, her husband. And so she was on the plane with her 5-year-old son, who sees another Black man and has this response of, I hope he doesn't have a gun. And so this really drives home the point of bias, and that we all have bias, and that it's formed by the society that we're in, and we all need to check it. So sometimes I think it can feel like we want to push it out because it's embarrassing to have bias, but her book really will shed a lot of light because it's clinical studies and shows the research of bias. And that's just one example of it.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. And her name again, Jennifer
Eberhardt.
Jennifer Eberhardt with Biased. Okay. Excellent. Thank you. So as we continue the conversation, we're here with Becky Naderman, 4 ways to challenge your unconscious bias. Notice, listen to the thoughts in your head, run that litmus test, which I think is just a great example of, and that spun us into that last conversation. And then the 4th one is watch out for white confidence. What does that look like, Becky? What is white confidence, and what does it look like to watch out for it?
White confidence is a term that I use for just the confidence that we can have when we're in a group of people who share our same race and have this assumption that everybody in the group is sharing our ideas. So we have the confidence to say things freely. Often this is the situation where we hear people making racist remarks that we're not sure how to respond to in these type of situations. But it's this confidence because as the white majority, we're constantly reaffirmed in our society through our media, through the people around us. Our opinions are reaffirmed. So it creates this false sense of being able to be correct more than what is actually true. And so I think that if we watch out for white confidence, that confidence of I'm in a space where people agree with me, and check what we're saying before we speak. So I think it's that idea of being quick to listen and slow to speak. And really asking ourselves, do we really have knowledge on this? What I'm going to say to the group, is it valid? Is it relevant? Does it need to be said? What is my purpose in speaking these words? Am I really an expert on this? Am I really the person to point out this fact, or is this fact even true?
Wow. So I'm thinking about the places that I would have seen that. And I know that part of your experience, and I know part of the conversation here is definitely, or the majority of it is about racial bias, but there's also from the majority, right? It's also the majority of people without disabilities in workplace situations. There is still a gender conversation. There are still things that where men in groups have conversations that a woman in that same situation would not have. So just thinking about those places where any one of us, or women in conversation, have conversations that men would not have, right? Any of those moments that we find ourselves, certainly the from a racial standpoint, certainly that white confidence that I have the ability to say what I'm going to say because I'm surrounded by other people who look and act and come from a background like mine, right?
Correct. And that's not even always accurate. Just because someone looks like us doesn't mean that they have that similar background. And I think about the times that I've been in a workspace and I've watched who have been the most vocal people at the table. And oftentimes it's the people in the majority. And they're not often, there have been times certainly that the comments made are not the smartest comments at the table either. Right. And so I think just having an awareness of the fact that even though we're in the majority, to watch our words and what we're saying and really ask ourselves if it's a valid point that's worth sharing or if it's just coming from a place of false confidence.
I do a fair amount of strategy work. And so my clients ask me for help them with strategic planning or facilitating strategic planning or then the implementation plans. And it's happened twice now in the last few months that I've been with a group of people or a small subset of that group who are talking about the strategy. And one of the things that's in the conversation these days is the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations. And people are trying to introduce that into their strategies and being aware that we're talking about bias. We're talking about trying to get better, right? Trying to be better humans. And in two different occasions now, I've had someone across the table from me say, well, we're an executive board or we're a leadership team, and we're trying to start this conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then they'll look and they'll go, but look at us. We're a bunch of old white men. And twice now they've used that exact phrase. We are a bunch of old white men. And so this is that white confidence. And I'm humbled by the times that they've said, we acknowledge it. Right? This is what you're talking about. Watch out for it. Acknowledge it. Don't just keep doing what you're doing. So what do you do then in that moment where you look around and you're like, whoa, we are a homogenous group or we're a group that is not diverse and we're talking about something we have no business talking about. What do we do, Becky?
Well, I think that's the first part, is just owning that moment there and being able to say that we can see that we have limitations. Yeah. And we need another voice in the room. And then how do we get that voice in the room? How do we bring the people to the table? If we're the leader, how do we make sure that all voices at the table are heard? And so it's not just the loudest voice in the room or the most confident, but that all voices and opinions are heard. And I think even if you're not a leader of a group, but you're a member of the group, you can, of course, guard your own self, but you can uplift someone next to you by, maybe you're the person who can say, well, what do you think, Susan? Or what do you think, Tom? Right? We can ask those kind of things to people to draw them into the conversation, or we can support what they say to elevate their voice more.
Really lovely. Thank you. I was thinking about some of the conversations that you and I have had in the past, and this isn't on your list of topics to talk about today, but I wondered to the extent you'd be willing to share. I've heard you say before that one of a way that we can stretch ourselves is to get ourselves into situations where we are not the part of the majority. And I'm looking back at moments when my daughter and I went to DC, and we stayed outside of the city. We stayed in a suburb and rode the commuter train to get into DC, and looking around on that train and being the vast minority as the only white people on the train, or one of maybe two others in all of our 4 days that we were there, and remembering the experience and the mental work that goes on in that. Okay, these are people who are going to their jobs and they're coming home to their families. Just like if I lived in a city, I would go to my job and I would come home to my families, and just repositioning that. What else can we do? So that happened to be a place that we were staying, and it wasn't even an intentional action. But you've talked about lifting up the person sitting next to you, but are there other things that we can do to help make sure that we're chipping away at that unconscious bias to be around in situations where we might experience what someone else is experiencing?
Well, I think that's certainly, doing things like listening to podcasts to get a different point of view of someone else's story, reading books, of course, those kind of things are good. But I really support this idea of putting ourselves in those uncomfortable places, because what we learn in that space is incredible. And then when we find ourselves in a position where we're back in the boardroom and we're not the minority, but there is someone there who is, we remember the experience that we had, and we can lift up their voice. What I always find is when I'm in situations where I'm in the minority, I am quieter. I'm quieter. And so if I notice that, then it's likely that's true for someone else in that position. Yeah. And I can help to draw them into the conversation, or I can remember that I was quieter, but I still wanted to participate. Or I still had ideas. And so I really find that is the best way for me to stay connected to people, is to put myself in a position of being the minority, because it teaches me so much.
Really lovely. Thank you, Becky. So if you are just joining in to the podcast, you've missed the meat of it. So you got to go back and listen to the rest of it. We've been talking about 4 ways to challenge your unconscious bias with Becky Naderman, who is the author of Walk With Me. 4 ways to challenge your unconscious bias include noticing, listening to the thoughts in your head, conducting that litmus test that Becky talks about, and then watching out for being aware of and paying attention to white confidence and what that looks like, and how to maybe do something different in the moment. So Becky, thank you. Thank you for these insights. One of the things that we do before we close the podcast is we always ask about something that's making you even better these days. So what is making you even better these days?
Well, what's making me even better these days is making sure to take quiet time for myself each day, to spend time in prayer, spend time in meditation, reflect, and instead of just running around like a chicken with my head cut off.
For sure. Becky, if our listeners want to reach out to you, if they want to get a copy of your book, Walk With Me, if they want to reach out and engage in conversation, what's the best way for them? Of course, they can reach out to Your Clear Next Step, and we will connect them. But is there another way that you would want them to reach you?
They can find me on Facebook under Becky Naderman, or they can find me on Facebook under my Walk With Me page. Also, my book is on Amazon. You have to put in Walk With Me and my pen name of R.A.Naderman.
Wonderful. Thank you, Becky. Any closing thoughts for us as we go our separate ways today?
Let's just give love to each other in this season of joy, and be kinder than necessary. And I think that if we can be quick to listen and slow to speak, we'll make great strides.
Absolutely. Thank you, Becky. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Seneca. It's always a pleasure.
And for those of you who are listening today, what a joy. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you missed any of it, go back, listen to the whole thing. If you haven't listened to Becky's other podcast, go find that as well. On behalf of all of us here at Your Clear Next Step, we hope the rest of your day is even better.
Thank you for tuning in today. The Even Better podcast will be back with more content soon. But in the meantime, subscribe to our podcast or check out our website at yourclearnextstep.com for more information. See you next episode.